Our next guest tonight is Simon, and I'm going to grab some Simon bio. Simon Beck. Simon is a myco enthusiast with over 10 years of experience foraging and eating many different species of fungi on Australia's east coast. Simon enjoys targeting new species and seeking out new locations for hunting. He has a particular interest in psilocybe. I'm going to say that different every time, and other psychoactive species, and helps run the PMANS, that's with a Z, group on Facebook, on Meta's Facebook. He has previously guided educational groups in the field, teaching others the basics of fungus identification, and plans to continue to do so into the future. Simon's academic background is in medicine and psychiatry, and welcome, Simon.
Thank you, Nick, and thanks, EJ, for another great event. Siobhan and Vince, thanks so much for your talks. I'm learning a lot listening to you both. And I am going to talk a little bit about setting and making the most of your psilocybin experience. I'll point out that this is a harm reduction presentation. I'm not condoning or encouraging any sorts of illicit activity. And if anybody wants to shoot any questions through to me or make contact for any other reason, there's my email address down the bottom there. I am also the secretary of the Australian Psychedelic Society, the other much smaller APS. So please get involved in supporting our volunteer-run organisation as well. Check out our YouTube channel and resources sometime when you have a moment. I wanted to try and present a fairly condensed set of things that you should consider when you are thinking about taking psilocybin mushrooms, particularly for the first time or when you are just starting out. So I've tried to go with a who, what, where, when, and how format of this to make it as easy to remember as possible. I'll just go through these and talk about some of the aspects that I think people should really give some consideration to when they're thinking about taking a psychedelic. This doesn't just apply to psilocybin. I think it applies to any psychedelic that you might be thinking about exploring. And I think that the best way to get the most out of your experience is to prepare properly so that you minimize the chance of having a or challenging experience. Not that difficult and challenging experiences can't also be turned into a positive, but they can be at times difficult to process, they can be traumatizing, and particularly where you are somebody who might have some psychological issues or some unresolved trauma, without adequate preparation, they can be sometimes quite confronting and potentially harmful as well. I think it's important to recognise that while they're physiologically safe, generally speaking, there are psychological risks associated with their use, and preparation is the best way to mitigate and manage those risks. So in terms of the what, it's important that you know what you are taking. And I know that sounds really obvious, but in Australia we have several different species of mushrooms that are particularly common, those being Psilocybe subaeruginosa, which grows from wood-loving substrates in the cold weather, Psilocybe cubensis and Panaeolus cyanescens that grow from dung in the warm weather. And the dose range and the potency of these things is markedly different. So for subaeruginosa and Panaeolus cyanescens, the dose is something like half that of typical cubensis. So it's important to know what species you're consuming, especially if you haven't picked it yourself, and particularly if you're buying it from somebody. Cubensis are commonly cultivated and sold in the underground, but subaeruginosa, because of their common availability out in the wild, are also often sold. So it's really important to know if you are sourcing it from somebody else to ask them what species it actually is. A mushroom isn't a mushroom. There's a massive difference in dose and something potentially a difference in the nature of the experience as well. The strain, if you are taking cultivated cubensis, can also be quite important because there's a lineage of strains from the Pinus envy cultivar that can be 1.5 or 2 times more potent than a typical cubensis strain. So really worth knowing exactly what strain you are getting as well if you are purchasing them from someone else, and bearing in mind that if you're growing them yourself, it's important to know that the strain can make a difference in terms of the potency. I mentioned there whether it's a known or a new batch. And the reason I say that is that within the same species, potency can also vary quite a lot, fairly significantly. And some people will often tell you that they've been out in the bush and they've taken one tiny little mushroom and it's absolutely blown their minds. And sometimes you need quite a few mushrooms for it to have any significant effect. So I think the best harm reduction advice around that, what's recommended is to take multiple doses, put them together in a way that homogenizes them so that you have a batch representing multiple doses, and then starting low and going slow and getting familiar with the potency of that particular batch. What I was saying was when you have a new set of mushrooms, it's a good idea to combine multiple doses together into a homogenized batch and then start low and get familiar with that batch, just because the potency between different specimens can vary so much. So we don't recommend eating individual mushrooms because that potency variance can be so significant. If you and your friends split up a number of fresh mushrooms and just eat a particular weight of whole specimens, the experience that you end up with, even if it's from the same patch, may be quite different. That's probably less of an issue when they're from the same cultivated batch, but if you're picking them out in the wild, it's worth bearing that in mind. And then, of course, dose is going to be sort of the most important factor of the nature of the experience that you end up having. And there are dosage charts and guides available online, so I won't go into that too much, but it's just worth bearing in mind that a lot of the dosage guides you'll see published are about cubensis. If the dose range goes up to 5 grams, it's talking about cubensis, 5 grams of subaeruginosa. And when I say 5 grams, I mean 5 dry grams. Mushrooms usually weigh about 10-fold wet what they do once they're dried. So do bear that in mind as well. If you're eating fresh ones, you need to consider the fact that that's a very different dosage range to when you're using dry ones. But double check dose range online for the particular species that you're taking before you go about starting to have those experiences. The next important thing to consider is the aspect of where you're taking them and perhaps where you shouldn't take them. And I think the number one thing to bear in mind there is safety and security. This is particularly important if you're thinking about taking them out in nature, which obviously is a really tempting place for you to take them. It's where you'll often be picking them. But there's obviously risks associated with doing these things out in the bush. And in those situations, I think it's particularly important to consider some emergency planning for if things do go wrong. And particularly important to have somebody sober around who can actually drive for help if need be, particularly if you're out of mobile reception, which frankly most of rural Australia is, as you can tell from my internet connection. So I think you don't necessarily need to focus on the possibility of things going badly, but it's always a good idea to prepare for that possibility and have some plans in place for what you and your friends or the people who are taking them with you will do if that does happen. Consider comfort. The experience is going to be a lot more pleasant if you're comfortable while you're having it. And some of the things to consider there is the having the place set up for you, having comfortable couch, comfortable cushions, having jumpers, being able to get warm if you need to, having some light and easy to consume food, particularly things like fruit around for if you do feel like eating something or starting to feel a little bit dark in the experience. Sometimes a little bit of sugar can really help with that. Really simple intervention to start trying to bring things back on the right track if they're starting to go a little bit awry. Have plenty of water available. And, the other thing with comfort is familiarity, particularly when you're just starting to explore these things. Being familiar with the environment that you are in can really help shape the experience in a positive way. It removes some of the anxiety. It just has that sense of homeliness and familiarity. And I think when you're starting out, it's probably wise to start in those familiar settings like your home or a friend's home, rather than being somewhere completely unfamiliar, like out in the bush or at a party or something like that. And consider any distractions that might pop up, particularly if you have responsibilities like children or pets, work that might call you in at odd hours, things like that. It's just really important to make sure that those distractions aren't going to get in the way of the experience, because because once you are under the influence, you're unlikely to be able to deal with those things all that effectively, and they can generate an awful lot of anxiety if unexpected things pop up. The other thing is things like loud noise, flashing lights, that sort of stuff. In terms of distraction, and Siobhan covered some of this in terms of how they set up rooms for psychedelic assisted therapy, is to just try and minimize the level of distraction that could present itself during the experience. In terms of thinking about when you are going to take it and perhaps when you shouldn't as well, things to bear in mind are your mood and any recent major stresses or ongoing stresses and any pending major life decisions. The nature of the experience can really be shaped by those aspects of what's going on in your life more broadly, and it's worth giving serious consideration to whether that is the right time to engage in one of these experiences. I know that a lot of people use these substances to try and address issues with their mood or try and deal with major life stresses, or perhaps even try and get a perspective on where to go with a major life decision that they're facing. But particularly if you're not familiar with these substances, those things can be really anxiety provoking. And often if you're in a difficult situation like that, I think all the more important to consider doing some more formalized preparation, be that with a psychologist or some active self-directed preparation to consider how you're going to deal with those thoughts when they do come up during the experience. And probably an even more important thing to have a sober sitter with you who you're familiar with, who you're comfortable with, who can help ground you if things start to get a little too anxious, if things start to go a little bit dark into a difficult place, who can maybe bring you back into a more positive mindset during the experience. The other things to consider there are aspects like any major medical problems that you're experiencing at the time. If you have things like a heart condition where your heart rate might go up at random times, those sorts of things can produce anxiety during the experience as well. Gastrointestinal issues, mushrooms, psilocybin, and some other psychedelics can have some pretty significant gastrointestinal effects. And if you've already got issues in that area that are worsened at that particular time, sometimes these things might make those feel a little bit worse and take your mind onto more difficult thoughts, making you think or focus on those medical issues that you're facing. So worth bearing in mind how you're going to deal with those experiences if they do come up. Combinations with other substances, I think are, best left out of the picture unless you're quite experienced with these things already, and particularly things like alcohol. I think lots of people have been in the situation where you're at a party and you've been drinking and somebody has some mushrooms or some other psychedelics, and there's maybe an impulsive sort of proposition to take those at that point in time without any preparation, without any real thought given to how that experience is going to turn out. And those will often turn out to be messy, difficult, and potentially not so positive experiences. So I think oftentimes best to leave those things out of the picture, particularly when you're less familiar. Cannabis is another one. A lot of people use cannabis, and a lot of people can find that can generate some anxiety while they're on a psychedelic. So just worth thinking about how you respond to the other substances that you might use during the experience as well, and trying to consider how the use of those other substances might interact with the psychedelic and shape the experience. And then there's the issue of substance withdrawal. If you do have substance dependence issues, some psychedelics can last quite a long time, and during that time, depending on your level of dependence to other substances, you might start to enter into a withdrawal state. That's obviously going to be quite anxiety generating and produce a whole bunch of unpleasant physical sensations. So have a management plan in place around those if that is an issue that you think that you might face. And responsibilities. If you have to go to work at 4 o'clock the next morning, then taking mushrooms at 10 o'clock at night probably isn't a very sensible idea. If you have to pick up your kids the next day, you might just want to give some consideration to whether that is really the time to be engaging in these sorts of experiences. Thinking about who you're taking them with and potentially who you shouldn't take them with is another really important factor. And again, I think safety is the critical thing there. As has already been mentioned, in some underground facilitator environments, there's been a lot of reports of Unacceptable behavior, breaching sexual boundaries, breaching personal boundaries, that sort of thing. You really need to know that you can trust the people that you are taking these substances with, that you can rely on them to help you if things get difficult, and that, they're not going to try and do anything that puts you in a difficult or uncomfortable situation or traumatizes you quite deeply, as can often be the case. Think about the relationship you have with the other people that you're taking them with. If there's unresolved issues with some of those people, if there's some tension in that relationship, sometimes that just can increase the chance that things are going to be a little bit more difficult. And again, some people take these substances with their partners to try and improve the bond or work through some relationship issues. But unless you're quite experienced with the substances, that's something that's probably better done with some facilitation from somebody else who both parties can trust to help them through that experience. And, again, just adds to the complexity of the situation. So it needs to be considered beforehand. Having a sober sitter is always a good idea. It's always something that's recommended. I know that it's not something that's often practiced, but if things do get out of hand or go down a difficult path, having somebody there who's sober and can help you is a really helpful thing. Sometimes if you can't have somebody come and be there in person, it's a good idea to just let somebody you really trust know that that's, that you're planning to have one of these experiences, and ask if it's okay, if you need to, can you get in touch with them? Make sure that they're available for you to give a phone call to, or they might be available to come around if things start to get out of hand, I think is a really good idea. Even knowing that somebody is there to help you through a difficult experience can help reduce the chances that you have a challenging experience, because there's that little bit of safety net reassurance in the background. And the other thing is the expectations and the intentions of the other people that you're considering dosing with. If you're really looking at having a deep, personally therapeutic, personally meaningful experience, and they're more interested in just having some fun and enjoying themselves and, playing some games or whatever, then you're sort of already starting off on a bad footing to have a difficult experience, because they're going to be thinking about it and approaching it and behaving in a very different way to what you might want to. So it's important to establish beforehand what exactly they're planning to do while you're on it, and what their intention out of it is, so that you can make sure you're all on the same footing before you go into it. And why are you taking it is also a really important consideration. The aspect of intention is particularly important if you are planning on having a therapeutically directed experience where you're trying to address some particular personal issue or something that you're facing in your life, maybe trying to gain a different perspective on some issue that you've been experiencing. And in that case, it's a really good idea to do some preparation beforehand, a lot of which Siobhan covered before, around thinking about where you want to take your mind during the experience, as well as how you might bring yourself back if that gets a little overwhelming. And there's a lot of psychologists out there now that can actually help people do some of that preparation work beforehand. They won't be doing the dosing session with you, but they can help you prepare for it, particularly if you are going into it with a therapeutic mindset for yourself to deal with some particular issue. Expectation is another aspect, which is, a sense of what you expect to happen that you're projecting onto the idea of the experience. And I think a lot of the time, particularly when you're just starting out, it's good to have a fairly broad and open mind in terms of what the experience is likely to be like, and try and go with the flow rather than being very concrete about what you plan to get out of it. And I think that's the same regardless of whether you're trying to just have some fun with them or whether you're trying to have some therapeutic intent with the experience. The less rigid you are in thinking the experience needs to go a particular way, the less likely you are to be upset or distressed if it doesn't happen to go that way. And just remember during the experience that there's always another opportunity. If things aren't going the way you were expecting them to or hoping them to, try and go with the flow, and remember that, the mushrooms are readily available, that they're everywhere. You will have another opportunity if that's something you decide you want to try again. And integration is really important, be that some self-directed integration, as Siobhan said, using journaling, trying to think through the experience, make sense of the experience, create meaning out of the experience, because often the messages that you receive while you are having those experiences aren't super specific, and they often require some meaning generation afterwards in terms of looking at what came up while you were having the experience and trying to put that in a, frame that in a way that makes sense for your life and what's going on for you, so that you can act in a way that maximizes the benefit you have from the different perspectives that came up during the experience. And again, some psychologists now will also help with both the preparation and the integration after the experience, even if they're not present during the experience, which can be a really useful thing, particularly if you're going into it with therapeutic intent. And I think is especially important if you are somebody who has some psychological issues and is trying to address some of those using these substances yourself. Having that professional support and a bit of structure around how you prepare and integrate the experience can be really, really useful and help maximize that benefit. And how to handle things if they do start to get dark. Have a think beforehand about how you might ground yourself if things start going in the wrong direction. A lot of the time people will do that by seeking something familiar, be that an object, an item, a smell, a sound, some particular music that puts you in a really good frame of mind that has some positive emotional memories associated with it, are all really useful ways to become grounded. And I've heard of some people grounding themselves if things start to get a little unusual or a little out of hand, or they start to detach a little bit more from reality than they wanted to, by reconnecting with what's actually going on in the real world. And as odd as it sounds, sometimes something like turning on the TV for a brief moment and just realizing that that's going in real time and that other people out there in the real world are watching the same thing can help sort of bring you back to that sense of reality and recognizing that you are still alive and real and part of the real world on a broader scale can be quite helpful. And then there are things like meditation, mindfulness, that sort of stuff that if you practice beforehand can be really useful during the experience to ground yourself. And rescue strategies as well. I won't go into it in any detail, but some people do use certain medications to either reduce the anxiety if it gets really out of hand, or to completely abort the experience. And benzos and antipsychotics are sometimes used in those situations. But obviously, if that's something you're planning on doing, you need to check that that's a safe thing to do with your doctor based on your medical history and any conditions that you might otherwise have as well. I'm certainly not recommending that anybody doses any pharmaceuticals of their own accord. And just a brief mention of wood lover paralysis. Kane, who's speaking shortly, and I have done a survey about this, and I think it's worth mentioning because it seems like it's actually not as rare as maybe we would have thought initially in Australia. It's caused by Psilocybus aeruginosa here. It's a transient loss of skeletal muscle function that can really vary in its severity, from minor loss of the use of the fine muscles in the hand to a complete paralysis of the whole body. It usually comes on and off in fairly short waves, but the time to onset can vary a lot. Some people actually only first notice the weakness way after the psychedelic effects have worn off, or even the next day, which is really important to remember if you're taking the wood lovers, to bear in mind that even the next day, you should probably avoid driving or operating machinery or anything like that, because you might notice at some point that you start to get some weakness that can really be quite impairing. And we had quite a number of people in our survey report some very dangerous situations that had arisen because of this. It's not limited to a particular substrate or habitat that we could tell. Patches that have caused it before are seemingly far more likely to cause it again. So if you have picked from a particular spot that's caused this and you don't want it to happen again, it's best to probably avoid that area in terms of where you source your mushrooms from. The compound responsible definitely survives drying and is definitely water soluble. So it doesn't matter whether you're having them fresh or dry or in a tea or with a lemon tech, it can still happen. And as I said here, it might be particularly dangerous when other causes of respiratory depression are present. That's things like alcohol, opiates, benzos. If you've got an underlying lung condition that makes it difficult for you to breathe, or if you happen to fall in a position, face down on the ground, and that impairs your respiration further. So I think with wood lovers, it's particularly important to give yourself that time the day after, not to need to do anything like driving. Don't jump on a push bike, try to avoid crossing roads, and even more important, to have a sober sitter with you. So I hope that gives a bit of an overview of some of the things that I think should be considered in terms of minimizing the harms or the risks potentially associated with using psilocybin or other psychedelics, and maximizing the benefit that you might get out of them as well.
Thank you very much, Simon. That was a fantastic summary, and it sounds like you've got it all memorized in a nice pattern there as well. That was really good.